Welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a look at lighting. Lighting can oftentimes make or break your environments, which is why it might feel a bit daunting sometimes. When you have that vision in your head for the perfect environment, exactly how you want it to look, and you get all the details in there, and then once you get to lighting, it's not quite matching up. It's not quite lining up. Today we'll take a simplistic approach to lighting, sort of breaking it down, demystifying it a little bit. This is also the same process which I use lighting on productions, shows such as Avatar: Last Airbender, for example. So I could go on and on about lighting, but let's just dive right in and let's take you through it. So before we dive straight into an environment, I wanted to go over some really important fundamental knowledge for lighting. This will really help when you're lighting your environments, and we'll sort of go through that here momentarily. So first and foremost, this is what's commonly referred to as a three-point lighting setup, where we have a light, sort of closer to camera. We have one further from camera, oftentimes parallel to the one closer, and then we have, of course, the key light and a fill light. So go back in here. One thing I will note also is a lot of the terms for different light positions or types of lights are really interchangeable. I've heard a lot of different terminology for different light positions and things like that, working with multiple directors of photography. But so these are just sort of commonality, sort of general terms that you might hear. But again, you might hear others. I'm not going to go over every single one because, again, there's quite a bit. But yeah, so for example, broadside oftentimes just refers to the light closest to camera. Short side is light further from camera, oftentimes sort of opposite from broadside. And then, of course, the key light, and then, of course, the fill. So let's sort of break this down kind of quickly, and then we'll jump into the environment stuff. So first and foremost, you have your fill light or your ambient light. In this case, for Unreal Engine, that ambient light is oftentimes just going to be your skylight. It's just going to be the ambient fill that sort of lifts everything globally, right? And so that one's pretty easy to go through. Then we have the broadside, which is, again, light closer to camera, oftentimes sort of in front, sort of at an angle of whatever the subject matter might be. We have short side, which is, again, parallel a little bit further. And then we have the key light. I've heard rim light. I've heard blinders, raking lights. I've heard a lot of different terminologies for this. When in doubt, if someone throws a rogue name at you for a light, place it here. And 90% of the times, you'll be correct. But yeah, this light is oftentimes just used to separate the subject from the background. And so, for example, if I turn that light off and or turn it back on, there we go. You see how it just sort of gives this sort of highlight of separation. If you're working in a particularly dark scene, this can become even more important. And even though right now, you might be looking at this like that's great for lighting characters, what about environments? This is a similar approach which we use for lighting, what we call hero assets in Unreal Engine oftentimes. And we'll jump into that right now. So in order to get started with lighting our environment, what we first and foremost want to do is figure out what mood, theme, story, time of day, reference, whatever it is that we want to strive for is really important to understand really before anything. And this is something that, I teach my Gnomon students all the time, is pick a mood, pick a theme, a story, whatever it might be, to ground your environment, to ground your lighting. And it becomes really important for lighting. For example, you wouldn't light a rom-com the same way you're going to light a horror movie. And there's specific reasons for that. And it becomes really important when you're trying to achieve these different moods. And so today we're going to go for just this sort of whimsical sort of sunset look. And let's go ahead and start this from scratch. So I just made a new lighting SL. There's nothing in it, as we can see, because the scene is just black. And first and foremost, we're going to start with an HDRI backdrop. You can use a You can use a sky sphere as well. I generally use HDRI backdrop primarily because in productions, we use HDRI skies, right? If we want to get the most photorealistic skies, the best way is to use photographed skies. That's one of the secrets to photorealism, actually. It's one of the things that I'll often tell people when they ask what's the secret to photorealism. It's photography, using as much photograph whatever as you can, photogrammetry, photograph skies, photograph textures, like all that stuff. You want to use as much reality as possible. So with this, we need to increase the scale because obviously it's a bit too small. So we can try something like 30,000 or 60,000, and we need to push this below the landscape. And if you want to get rid of these lines like this, personally, I don't like looking at them. I mean, in the scene, it doesn't really like make a difference, but because we're not going to see it. But still, if you want to get rid of that, you could just match this projection center, and it'll get rid of that. Okay, the next thing is before we go in here and start adding in directional lights and fog and all that stuff, we want to actually just rough in this skylight a bit more. So first and foremost, we want to pick the actual sky we're going to be using. And today I'm going to be using this sky, which I actually got from a site called 2G Academy. It's really great. I'll I'll have the link in the description down below. But they have really beautiful skies with like no clutter. There's like no trees or anything in them. So they're really great to use like that. And we need to also go into the skylight and change it. The reason we need to do that is because if I were to go in here, obviously this is a bit too dark, and change this to sort of brighten it up, we see it's going to brighten the sky as well. And we want to have individual control over that. So if we go into the skylight and go to specified cube map and select that sky, now we can fine tune that skylight intensity. So in here, when you're doing this, don't fall into the trap of going in here and really fine tuning it, balancing it. Is it supposed to be 1 or is it supposed to be like 1.05? Is that the right number? You don't need to spend so much time initially setting this up. The initial setup should be really like as quick and rough and dirty as possible. So we're really just going to get in approximate. Generally what I do is I'll set a sort of range. So for example, I'll go to something like 5, let's say, and we look at it, and I'll go back to my camera and we're looking at it. 5's probably a little bit too bright. And so we'll drop down to, let's say, 4. That didn't really even do anything. So we'll drop down to 1. 1's a little too dark, maybe. And 3 might work. So I've just created myself a range. So I know when I come back to finesse this, it's going to be a value between 1 and 3. That will help me so that as I start refining my lighting, I'm not going to start throwing out just random, wacky numbers because I just don't know what it should be. I'm working within a range. So I know I just set myself parameters to make it a bit easier. Those parameters are the value between 1 and 3. And so I'm just going to leave it at 3 for now. I think that's fine. And next I'm going to bring in a directional light. And this directional light, if you're using an HDRI sky, you want to use the approximate orientation of where the sun actually is in the sky. If it's not like a big beaming, sunlight, like here, for example, we don't actually see the sun itself, but we do know that the sun is somewhere over here. So I'm going to go over here. I'm just going to rotate it to be approximately, and of course change it to movable, and to be approximately where that sun would actually be. So going in here, like this, and just finding a good position for it, rotating that sun until I find something that I like. So yeah, let's go with something like that for now. And again, we're just sort of roughing things in right now. It doesn't have to be exact, doesn't have to be perfect. We're just sort of roughing in these details. And we'll leave it about right here. And we'll do the same thing. So we'll look at the intensity. 10, of course, is going to be too high. So let's drop it down to 1. 1 might be a bit too soft. I think if we're going for realism over believability, 1 might be correct. But generally, like especially when you're working on movies, generally we're more concerned with believable lighting as opposed to real lighting. Oftentimes, how reality looks is somewhat boring, and we want, our movies and our scenes to look, to look good. Which is why oftentimes when, we're working on, different shows and such, we're going more so for believability as opposed to capturing one-to-one reality. So 1 could work. It's probably a bit too low. We'll crank that up to, let's say, 4. 4 might be a little bit too bright, but for now, kind of leave it at 4, just because also the HDRI, I left at that sort of brighter number, so just kind of leave it at that. The other thing is we want our shadows to be a bit softer, so we can just increase this source angle a little bit, like so. You can also try playing around with the indirect lighting intensity. So for example, these shadows that are closer to us, like they're a bit dark, and so we can maybe try boosting this a little bit, like 5, just bringing in a little bit more light. It's a subtle detail, but it works pretty well. I would not recommend cranking this up too high. Like if you get to 25, it'll start to give this really kind of weird artificial look to your scene. It'll also kind of make things kind of look blurry a little bit. So generally, like at most, maybe a value of like 8, but 5 is probably like as high as you want to take it before it starts looking not believable. And so we got that. And so next thing we're going to do is add a post-process volume. And in the post-process volume, we're going to go down here, set this to infinite extent unbound. That way it affects the entire environment. And one thing I like to do in my environments is I'll go up here to this film and I'll drop this slope down to 0.7. The reason being is it just adds a bit more dynamic range to the scene. It lifts sort of everything up. This is something I do because I tend to do my color corrections in like DaVinci Resolve if it's a movie, or in Photoshop if it's an image. And so decreasing this sort of helps with my color correction workflow. If you don't have that sort of color correction workflow, you can, leave it at 0.88 and try to balance it more so, in the actual settings in your post-process volume if you'd like. Okay, so from here, the other thing is the actual exposure. There's a lot of different, videos on exposures and things like that. But generally speaking, this is usually about as far as I go with how in-depth I go into my exposure settings. If I want it brighter, or if I want to increase my exposure, I just increase exposure compensation. If I want it darker, then I decrease the exposure compensation. The reason being is because it's going to give you basically the same result as pretty much all the other, sort of stuff. And it's the path of least resistance. It's the least complicated way to control your exposure, right? We're not going in and spending a bunch of time, adjusting ISO apertures and all that stuff. We're just going in and do I want it brighter? Yes. Higher number. Do I want it darker? Yes. Lower number. And so we'll just leave everything as is right here. And next step is I'm going to bring in the exponential height fog. The reason I saved this for last is because the actual fog effects can sometimes be a bit distracting. And we don't want to be distracted as we're lighting our scene, right? So I'm going to turn on volumetric fog, and I'm going to increase this view distance. That way the fog sort of goes all the way back, as opposed to just, 6,000 units or whatever back. So we have this going for us. We have some fog in here. We have our light set up. Now we do sort of phase 2, which is refining it all a bit. So I'm going to turn this fog off because the fog should really be one of your least concerns. Even if your scene is pretty fog heavy, you want to make sure that your lights are well balanced before you focus on your fog. And so we're going to go in here, and just as I started with the skylight, I'm going to in phase 2, going to come back in here and start with the skylight. So again, I think mine is a little bit too bright. So I'm going to drop it down. This is where we can fine tune it a little bit. So something like a value of 2. Yeah, that might work. And so instead of going into, trying to go in here and, 1.5 or 1.8, is it 1.95? I'm just going to leave it at 2. I'm going to go into light color and I'm going to inject a little bit of blue into the scene, into my skylight. So we could just add a little bit of blue. And then if I want it darker, then I can just turn it down in the actual values right here. And it'll give a similar sort of look to your scene as well. And so we do that. And the next step is going to be same sort of thing with the directional light. So we're going to go in here and give it more of this golden sort of color. The white doesn't really match the sunset vibe. And so we go in here, sort of add this. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll just like make it saturated to the max just to kind of see like where it's affecting, how it's affecting everything. And then I'll sort of pull back. It's fine to sort of go further than you're going to be and then pull back. It can sometimes actually make things a bit quicker. And so we'll sort of add that, make it a bit orange. Cool. And then I'm going to go back into that skylight. Now that I added that, now the skylight I think might actually end up being a bit too dark. We changed the color, we changed the value, and so we're just going to increase that a little bit. And this is the repetition. This is the loop for achieving believable lighting. Is, you start with a range and then you get more and more refined. So, maybe that value of 3, for example, worked. And with this one being a bit whimsical, we'll just add a little bit of bloom to the scene. And just increase that a little bit. I don't know. Personally, I like things when they glow. And so now that we got that set up, now we'll look at the fog. So obviously this fog is a bit too much. So one thing we can do is in our directional light, go down here, go to the light shaft occlusion, and you can add light shaft bloom if you want. This only really works if you're like looking at it. So if it's off to the side, you're not really going to see it. We can, increase, decrease the volumetric scattering intensity here if we want. We can reduce it to 0 so it doesn't do anything. We can reduce it to 0.5. We can increase it. We're just going to leave it at 1, and then we're going to control it in here. So we'll just go in here, and first and foremost, I think my fog is going a bit too high for my taste. So I'm going to increase this fog height fall off. I just want it to be kind of low, like it's settled into the trees. And so now that it's here, now the fog looks a bit better. Maybe I don't necessarily have to, change the extinction scale much, but I'll still sort of play with it, just sort of see the looks that we can get. Right? So increase it, decrease it. And the one thing I'll generally do as well is I will match this. I actually go back and forth. So I'll kind of use the skylight color first to kind of see. So for example, I'll make this a bit blue and see how that looks. And then I'll go back the opposite way. In this case, make it a bit orange and see how that looks. And I think we'll probably just keep it a bit more. Let's see. This one is more aesthetically what you might be going for. We'll just leave it over here, just slightly more orange. And then lastly, a great little thing to do is go into your path tracing just to sort of proof your environment, to kind of look at it and see. I usually turn off the height fog for this and see how does your lit mode look in comparison to path tracing. So going back and forth and seeing the difference. Obviously, it's going to look different because it's using a different algorithm, but you do want them to look relatively similar. So you want to be on the right track with all of this. So path tracing, lit, they're looking pretty similar. The shadow detail over here in path tracing is a little bit different. It's getting a bit more of that sort of orange color in here, almost purple. And so with that being said, if we like that look where it's getting a bit more sort of purple because it's sort of blending between the lights, we can actually just kind of artificially do that ourselves by making this light a little bit more purple to sort of fake that same sort of look. And so, yeah, that's probably a bit too purple, like so. And this directional light is probably a bit too bright. So we'll drop this down to, let's say, 2. There we go, it's looking a bit better. And then last little tip that goes back to what we initially showed in this video is actually going to be using that same process of that 3-point light setup and using it on your environments. This is something that we do quite often in productions to highlight certain areas of environments. We treat these, what we call hero assets, as characters themselves. And so, for example, let's say we wanted to really highlight this building right here, sort of front and center. What we can actually do is we can go up to it, and I'm going to go in here and grab a rectangle light, like so. Oops. And then I'm going to change it to movable. And then I'm going to crank up this attenuation radius right now. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to crank up the intensity pretty drastically right now. It's like 15,000, maybe even more, 50,000. Like, just get kind of nutty with it. You do want to turn off volumetric intensity because you don't want this light to be like super obvious that it is here. And the other thing, I'm going to increase this source width and this source height, or source height then source width. Okay. And then I'll look through my camera. And that's probably a bit too much right now. Drop back down to like 15,000. And right now what I'm doing is I'm just looking for a good sort of position. And going back to that, the broadside, short side, and key light we were looking at, you can use that same sort of principle on your 3D assets. So for example, here we have this light that's sort of broadside, and then we can rotate it to make it more short side. However, short side on this side doesn't really make sense because the light is coming from the left. And so really what we have is we have the ability, we have this sort of range for which we can place the light, which is really a range between like here and somewhere over here. Like so. I'm gonna just raise this up so it hits that roof a bit more. Go back in here. All right, so now we have more of a key light on this castle. And again, the reason I made it bright and increased the attenuation radius is really just to more visibly see what we're working at or looking at. If we were to use the actual values we're going to actually be using, it would be a bit more difficult to really see that change. And so what we can do in here is we can grab that same light color and actually just take this. If you take this, drag this up here, it'll actually save that color for you. Then we'll go into our rec light, change that color. And now we can, now that 15,000 actually looks kind of appropriate, but we will drop it down a little bit. So again, same process, we're finding that range. So 5,000 I think looks pretty good. And then the attenuation radius just to kind of affect the area that we want to affect. And then, you can add even more to this if you want. Maybe you want to have a bit of that light just sort of hitting the edge over here, like so. We want to do this, and maybe we'll reduce that width and pull down that attenuation radius so it's only affecting this portion, and probably even decrease that intensity, like 2,500, maybe 500. Turn that off and on to see the difference. Okay. And now we'll pull back over here. And now we'll take a look. And so again, using that 3-point lighting sort of setup to really draw focus, sort of add a bit more appeal to the scene like this can really be an effective method to just adding a bit more character, a bit more sort of charm to your environment. So I hope this video was helpful for you guys. I have a lot more videos coming out as well, sort of breaking down these sort of settings, sort of demystifying Unreal Engine, if you will. So stay tuned for those, and I'll catch you guys next time.